Picture this. You spend 4 years of your life building something magnificent. Something that processes $2 billion in transactions every single day. Something so critical that if it goes down for even 30 minutes, major banks start losing millions and regulatory alarms start screaming across 3 federal agencies. Now imagine the new CEO walks in, calls your life's work outdated legacy code, fires you in front of your entire team, and then discovers he has absolutely no idea how to keep it running. This is that story. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first time I laid eyes on Marcus Sullivan, he was standing in the marble lobby of TechFlow Dynamics, wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, checking his Apple Watch like time itself was waiting for his permission to continue. His hair was perfectly styled in that executive way that screams expensive barber visits twice a week, and he carried himself with the kind of confidence that only comes from never having been told no by anyone who mattered. He looked like every tech bro who'd ever walked into a conference room and declared himself a visionary, while the people who actually built things sat quietly in the corner taking notes. I was Sarah Chen, and I'd been the senior systems architect at TechFlow for exactly 4 years, 2 months, and 16 days. Not that I was counting, but when you've spent that much time pouring your soul into something, you tend to remember the milestones. I had designed, built, and maintained the Phoenix Payment Platform, a real-time financial processing system that had grown from my initial proof of concept into a $500 million powerhouse that handled transactions for 12 major banks across the United States. Every morning when I walked into our Austin headquarters, I could feel the quiet hum of thousands of servers processing millions of transactions, and I knew that every single line of that code had passed through my hands at some point. Marcus had been hired as our new CEO after our previous leader, Carol Martinez, had stepped down to spend more time with her family. Carol had been the kind of leader who actually understood technology, who would sit in on architecture reviews and ask intelligent questions about scalability and security protocols. She trusted her team because she understood what we did. Marcus, from what I'd heard through the industry grapevine, had spent the last 5 years as a VP at a consulting firm where his primary job was convincing other companies to buy software solutions he'd never actually implemented himself. The all-hands meeting where Marcus introduced himself was scheduled for 10 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in October. I arrived 15 minutes early, as I always did, and claimed my usual spot in the 3rd row where I could see both the presenter and gauge the room's reaction. The auditorium was buzzing with the nervous energy that always accompanies leadership changes. People were whispering about what this meant for current projects, whether there would be layoffs, if the company culture would shift. I sat quietly, observing, my hands folded in my lap, wearing my standard uniform of dark jeans, a black blazer, and comfortable flats that could handle the miles of walking I did through our data centers each day. Marcus took the stage like he was accepting an award rather than introducing himself to the people who actually made the company run. His opening line was delivered with the kind of practiced charm that immediately put me on edge. "I know change can be scary," he said, scanning the room with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "But I'm here to take TechFlow from good to extraordinary. We're going to streamline everything, eliminate redundancies, and focus on what really drives revenue." The word redundancies hung in the air like a threat. I'd been through enough corporate restructures to know that when new executives started talking about eliminating redundancies, they usually meant eliminating people. What bothered me more was his casual dismissal of our current success as merely good. Phoenix processed $2 billion in daily transactions with 99.97% uptime. In the financial technology world, that wasn't good. That was legendary. After his presentation, Marcus made his way through the crowd, shaking hands and making small talk with the kind of practiced ease that came from years of working rooms full of people whose names he'd never remember. When he approached our engineering cluster, I stood up and extended my hand. "Sarah Chen, Senior Systems Architect," I said, making direct eye contact the way my mother had taught me was important in professional settings. He shook my hand briefly, his attention already scanning past me to the next person. "Great to meet you, Sarah. I'm excited to learn more about our technical infrastructure." His tone was polite but generic, the same thing he'd probably said to 20 other people that morning. There was no recognition in his eyes, no indication that he understood I was the person responsible for the system that generated most of the company's revenue. Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus held a series of strategic review meetings with department heads and key personnel. I wasn't invited to any of them. This struck me as odd, considering that Phoenix was not only our largest revenue generator but also our most complex technical achievement. Instead, I heard secondhand from Jessica Park, my friend in the product team, that Marcus was asking a lot of questions about modernizing our legacy systems and bringing in fresh talent with contemporary approaches. The first real red flag came during a routine architecture review meeting that I'd been running monthly for the past 3 years. These meetings were where we discussed system performance, planned upgrades, and addressed any technical debt that needed attention. Marcus decided to attend this particular meeting, arriving 10 minutes late with his assistant trailing behind him taking notes on an iPad. I was in the middle of presenting our Q3 performance metrics when Marcus interrupted. "Sarah, can we cut to the chase here? What I'm hearing is a lot of technical jargon about maintaining status quo. What I want to know is how we're innovating." His tone wasn't hostile, but it carried the impatience of someone who believed his time was being wasted. I paused, choosing my words carefully. "The innovations are in the reliability and scalability improvements. Last quarter, we increased our transaction processing capacity by 30% while reducing latency by 12 milliseconds. In financial processing, that translates to millions of dollars in improved efficiency for our bank clients." Marcus leaned back in his chair, and I caught him exchanging a look with his assistant that I couldn't quite interpret. "Right, but what about artificial intelligence integration, machine learning capabilities, blockchain applications? These are the technologies that are disrupting financial services." I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that came from having to explain complex technical concepts to someone who didn't want to understand them. Those technologies have their applications, but our clients chose Phoenix because it's stable, secure, and regulatory compliant. When you're processing $2 billion in daily transactions, innovation means building systems that work flawlessly, not chasing technological trends that haven't proven themselves at scale. The room was silent for a moment. Jessica, who was sitting across from me, gave me a supportive nod, but I could feel the energy shift. Marcus smiled, but it was the kind of smile that made me think he'd already made up his mind about something. "Well, maybe it's time we started thinking bigger," he said. After the meeting, Jessica lingered behind as everyone else filed out. "That was intense," she said quietly. I don't think he liked being challenged. I gathered my laptop and papers, my mind already racing through the implications of what had just happened. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I wasn't challenging him," I said. "I was explaining reality. There's a difference." But even as I said it, I knew that distinction probably didn't matter to Marcus Sullivan. In his world, questioning his vision was the same as questioning his authority, and I had a sinking feeling that he wasn't the type of person who tolerated either. The following week, Marcus announced a company-wide efficiency initiative. The email, sent at 7 a.m. on a Monday morning, outlined his plan to eliminate operational redundancies and streamline our technical infrastructure to align with contemporary industry standards. Reading between the lines wasn't difficult. He was planning to restructure the engineering team, and based on our previous interactions, I had a pretty good idea of where I stood in his vision for the company's future. What Marcus didn't know, what he hadn't bothered to learn during his strategic reviews and efficiency assessments, was that Phoenix wasn't just a system I had built. It was a system I had built with certain safeguards, certain protocols that ensured it could only be maintained and modified by someone who understood its architecture intimately. When I had originally designed Phoenix, I had learned from the mistakes of previous companies who had lost control of their critical systems due to inadequate documentation or over-reliance on external contractors. Phoenix had what I privately called the dead man switch, a series of authentication protocols and emergency shutdown sequences that were hard-coded into the system's core architecture. These weren't backdoors or security vulnerabilities. They were legitimate system administration tools designed to prevent unauthorized modifications and ensure that the system could be safely shut down if it was ever compromised. The documentation for these protocols existed in exactly one place: my personal encrypted files stored on a secure server that only I had access to. I had implemented these safeguards with the full knowledge and approval of Carol Martinez, who had understood that critical infrastructure needed protection not just from external threats, but from internal ones as well. "Sarah," she had said, "during one of our quarterly reviews, I trust you to build something that protects us from our own stupidity. Make sure it's bulletproof, even if the bullet is coming from inside the building." So I had. Phoenix was bulletproof, elegant, and absolutely dependent on my continued involvement for its operation and maintenance. It was the kind of system that worked so seamlessly that people forgot how complex it actually was. How many thousands of decisions and safeguards were built into every function. Marcus Sullivan was about to learn exactly how much he didn't know about the system that generated most of his company's revenue. The end came on a Thursday afternoon in November. Marcus had scheduled individual meetings with each member of the engineering team, ostensibly to discuss role optimization and career development opportunities. I was the last appointment of the day, scheduled for 4:30 p.m. in his corner office overlooking the Austin skyline. I arrived precisely on time, as I always did, carrying a folder with the latest Phoenix performance reports and a notebook where I'd jotted down some thoughts about potential system improvements for the coming year. Marcus was sitting behind his glass desk, his laptop open, looking every inch the modern executive with his rolled-up sleeves and carefully cultivated 5 o'clock shadow. "Sarah, come in, have a seat," he said, gesturing toward one of the uncomfortable modern chairs positioned in front of his desk. I sat down, crossed my legs, and waited. In my experience, meetings like this were won or lost in the first 30 seconds, and I wanted to see his hand before I showed mine. Marcus closed his laptop with deliberate precision and folded his hands on the desk. "I'm going to be direct with you, Sarah, because I respect your time and your contribution to this company." The phrase immediately set off alarm bells. In CR, corporate speak, when someone starts a conversation by telling you how much they respect you, you're about to be disrespected. "I've been reviewing our technical infrastructure and team composition," he continued, "and I've made some difficult decisions about how we move forward. The reality is that Phoenix, while functional, represents old-school thinking. It's complex, expensive to maintain, and built on architecture patterns that don't align with modern development practices." I kept my expression neutral, but my pulse quickened. He was criticizing my life's work without understanding the first thing about it. "Phoenix processes $2 billion in daily transactions with industry-leading uptime and security metrics," I said calmly. "Our bank clients have consistently rated it as the most reliable platform in their infrastructure stack." Marcus waved his hand dismissively. "I'm not questioning its current functionality, Sarah. I'm talking about strategic vision. We need to be building systems that can scale rapidly, integrate with emerging technologies, and attract top-tier engineering talent. Phoenix is a legacy system, and frankly, so are the approaches you've been using to maintain it." The insult landed exactly as he'd intended it to. He wasn't just calling my system outdated, he was calling me outdated. I felt the familiar surge of anger that I'd learned to channel into cold professionalism over years of dealing with men who mistook their confidence for competence. "What exactly are you proposing?" I asked, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. Marcus leaned forward, adopting the tone of someone delivering good news. "We're going to rebuild our payment infrastructure from the ground up using microservices architecture, containerized deployment, and cloud-native technologies. It's an exciting opportunity to create something truly cutting-edge." I stared at him for a moment, processing the magnitude of what he was suggesting. He wanted to throw away 4 years of proven, battle-tested infrastructure to chase technological buzzwords that sounded impressive in board meetings, but would take years to implement and test to the level of reliability that financial institutions required. "That would take at least 2 years to build and certify," I said. "Our bank clients aren't going to wait 2 years for us to reinvent something that already works perfectly. And the regulatory approvals alone would cost millions of dollars and require extensive security audits." Marcus smiled, and I realized that my objections were exactly what he'd been expecting. "Which brings me to the difficult part of this conversation, Sarah. I don't think you're the right person to lead this transformation. Your expertise is valuable, but it's tied to old systems and old ways of thinking. We need fresh perspectives. People who can think outside the constraints of legacy architecture." There it was, the real purpose of the meeting. I was being fired, dressed up in corporate language about transformation and fresh perspectives, but fired nonetheless. I sat back in my chair and looked at Marcus Sullivan, really looked at him, and I realized that he had absolutely no idea what he was about to do to his company. "I see," I said quietly. "And you've already identified my replacement?" "We're bringing in a consulting team from Silicon Valley," Marcus said, his enthusiasm genuine now that he was talking about his own plan. "They specialize in financial technology transformation. They've helped 3 major companies migrate from legacy systems to modern architectures. They'll be here next week to begin the assessment process." I nodded slowly, my mind already moving through the implications of what he'd just told me. A consulting team from Silicon Valley who specialized in transformation projects probably had experience with generic financial systems, but they wouldn't have any knowledge of Phoenix's specific architecture, its security protocols, or its integration points with our clients' systems. More importantly, they wouldn't have access to the administrative controls and documentation that existed only in my encrypted files. "And my last day?" I asked. "Today, actually," Marcus said, his tone shifting to something approaching sympathy. "I know it seems sudden, but we found that transition periods tend to create more confusion than clarity. HR has prepared a severance package that I think you'll find generous. 6 months of salary, full benefits continuation, and positive references for any future opportunities." I stood up slowly, gathering my folder and notebook. "I understand," I said. "I'll need a few minutes to collect my personal items and transfer any critical documentation." Marcus shook his head. "Actually, our IT security protocol requires that terminated employees leave immediately. Your personal items will be boxed up and shipped to you, and any company documentation stays with the company." Of course it did. Marcus had done his homework on corporate termination procedures, even if he hadn't done his homework on the system that generated most of his revenue. I extended my hand to shake his, a gesture of professional courtesy that felt like play acting. "Good luck with the transformation, Marcus," I said, making eye contact one final time. "I hope the consulting team works out for you." He shook my hand with the satisfied smile of someone who believed he'd just solved a problem. "Thank you, Sarah. I genuinely appreciate your contributions to TechFlow, and I'm confident this change will benefit everyone in the long run." I walked out of Marcus Sullivan's office at 4:57 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon, my badge deactivated, my access revoked, my 4 years of work dismissed as legacy thinking. As I rode the elevator down to the lobby, I wasn't angry yet. I was curious. How long would it take for Marcus and his consulting team to realize that they had just fired the only person who knew how to keep their $500 million system running? I had a feeling I wouldn't have to wait very long to find out. The drive home from TechFlow that Thursday evening felt surreal, like I was moving through someone else's life. Austin traffic crawled along Mopac, giving me plenty of time to process what had just happened while watching the downtown skyline fade in my rearview mirror. The November air was crisp, and the familiar sight of food trucks and tech company shuttles should have felt comforting. But instead, everything seemed slightly off-kilter, as if someone had shifted the world a few degrees while I wasn't paying attention. I lived in a small house in South Austin, a 2-bedroom craftsman bungalow that I'd bought 3 years ago, when Phoenix's success had finally given me the financial stability to stop renting. The house was my sanctuary, filled with books on systems architecture, a small herb garden that I somehow managed to keep alive despite my demanding schedule, and a home office where I could work on side projects and continuing education without the constant interruptions of corporate life. As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed my neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, watering her front garden. She waved, and I managed to smile and wave back, grateful that she wasn't the type to come over and chat. I needed silence, space to think through what Marcus had just set in motion. The last thing I wanted was to explain to well-meaning neighbors why I was home early on a weekday. Inside, I made myself a cup of tea and sat at my kitchen table, staring out at the small backyard where the late afternoon light was filtering through the oak trees. For the first time since walking into Marcus's office, I allowed myself to feel the full impact of what had happened. 4 years of my life, dismissed as outdated thinking. A system that processed billions of dollars in transactions daily, written off as legacy code by someone who had never written a line of code in his life. But underneath the sting of professional rejection, there was something else brewing. A quiet certainty that Marcus Sullivan had just made the biggest mistake of his corporate career. He had fired me without understanding what I actually did, without comprehending the intricate web of dependencies and safeguards that kept Phoenix running smoothly 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I opened my laptop and navigated to my personal encrypted drive, where I kept backups of all my critical documentation. The Phoenix system architecture was laid out in thousands of pages of technical specifications, security protocols, and operational procedures. But buried deep within those files was something that Marcus's consulting team would never find: the complete documentation for Phoenix's emergency protocols. When I had originally built Phoenix, I had learned from the cautionary tales of other systems architects who had watched their life's work get destroyed by incompetent management or malicious actors. The emergency shutdown sequence wasn't a backdoor or a security vulnerability. It was a legitimate administrative function designed to safely halt all transaction processing in the event of a critical system compromise or unauthorized access attempt. The shutdown sequence required a series of encrypted authentication keys that were generated using a combination of my biometric data, a passphrase that existed only in my memory, and a hardware token that I kept in my personal safe. Even if someone managed to obtain 1 or 2 of these elements, they would need all 3 to execute the shutdown protocol. More importantly, the system was designed so that once the shutdown sequence was initiated, it could only be reversed by the same authenticated user who had triggered it. I had implemented these safeguards with Carol Martinez's full knowledge and approval. We had both understood that in the world of financial technology, the greatest threats often came from inside the organization. Disgruntled employees, overzealous executives, hostile takeovers. All of these scenarios required protective measures that went beyond traditional cybersecurity protocols. The beauty of the Phoenix shutdown sequence was its elegance. It wasn't designed to cause damage or steal data. Instead, it would gracefully halt all transaction processing, notify our bank clients that the system was undergoing emergency maintenance, and preserve all transaction logs and audit trails in a secure, read-only state. From the outside, it would look like a planned maintenance window. From the inside, it would be immediately obvious that something had gone very, very wrong. As I reviewed the documentation, I realized that Marcus had unknowingly created the perfect storm for system failure. By firing me immediately and revoking my access without any transition period, he had ensured that no one at TechFlow had the knowledge or credentials to maintain Phoenix's more sophisticated functions. The basic transaction processing would continue to work for a while, but the system's self-monitoring capabilities, security updates, and performance optimizations all required administrative access that only I possessed. More critically, Phoenix was designed to automatically initiate its security protocols if it detected unusual access patterns or unauthorized modification attempts. If Marcus's consulting team started poking around in the system architecture without proper authentication, Phoenix would interpret their activities as a potential security breach and begin locking down its more sensitive functions. I closed my laptop and walked to my safe, retrieving the small hardware token that served as one of the authentication keys for Phoenix's emergency protocols. It was an innocuous little device, about the size of a USB drive, with a small LED that would flash when it was actively communicating with the system. Marcus had no idea this device existed, let alone that it was sitting in my personal safe rather than locked away in some corporate security vault. The ethical implications of what I was considering weren't lost on me. Phoenix processed transactions for millions of people every day, and any disruption to the system would have real-world consequences. But I wasn't planning to hurt innocent people or steal money. I was simply considering exercising the legitimate administrative controls that I had built into the system I had created. Friday morning, I woke up earlier than usual and decided to treat the day as the beginning of an unexpected vacation. I made breakfast, read the news, and tried to ignore the constant buzz of my phone as TechFlow colleagues sent messages expressing shock and support about my sudden departure. Most of them had learned about my termination through office gossip, since Marcus had apparently decided not to send any kind of official announcement about the personnel change. Around 10 a.m., Jessica called. "Sarah, what the hell happened?" she said without preamble. "People are saying you got fired yesterday, but nobody knows why. Marcus won't answer questions about it, and HR is being all mysterious and corporate." I had been expecting this call, and I had spent some time thinking about how to handle it. Jessica was a good friend, but she was also still employed at TechFlow, and I didn't want to put her in an awkward position by sharing too many details about my conversation with Marcus. "It was a strategic decision," I said carefully. "Marcus wants to take the company in a different direction, technologically, and he felt like my approach wasn't aligned with his vision." "That's insane," Jessica said. "Phoenix is the most successful system the company has ever built. Our clients love it. It makes money. It works perfectly. What more does he want?" I smiled despite myself. Jessica understood the value of what we had built, even if Marcus didn't. He wants to rebuild everything using microservices and cloud-native architecture. He thinks Phoenix represents old-school thinking. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "He wants to rebuild Phoenix from scratch? Sarah, that would take years and cost millions, and our clients would have to go through recertification processes with their compliance departments. That's completely insane." "I know," I said simply. "Did you try to explain that to him?" I tried. He wasn't interested in hearing about implementation challenges or client requirements. He's already hired a consulting team to start the assessment process. Jessica let out a low whistle. "This is going to be a disaster. Does he have any idea how complex Phoenix actually is? I mean, I work on the product side, and even I know that system has thousands of integration points and security protocols." "No," I said. "I don't think he does." We talked for a few more minutes, with Jessica filling me in on the office atmosphere and the rumors that were circulating about upcoming changes. Apparently, Marcus had scheduled an all-hands meeting for Monday morning to discuss the exciting new direction the company would be taking. I found myself curious about what he would tell the staff about my departure and his plans for Phoenix. After ending the call with Jessica, I spent the afternoon doing research on the consulting firm that Marcus had hired. A quick Google search revealed that they were called Velocity Solutions, a San Francisco-based company that specialized in digital transformation and legacy system modernization. Their website was full of buzzwords and case studies about helping companies migrate from outdated infrastructure to cutting-edge cloud platforms. What struck me as I read through their marketing materials was how generic everything sounded. They claimed expertise in financial technology, but their case studies seemed to focus on relatively simple systems, customer relationship management platforms, basic e-commerce sites, internal communication tools. None of their documented experience involved anything close to the complexity and regulatory requirements of a real-time payment processing system that handled billions of dollars in daily transactions. I also noticed that their team bios were heavy on management consulting experience and light on actual technical expertise. The lead consultant assigned to the TechFlow project had an MBA from Stanford and previous experience at McKinsey, but his technical background seemed to consist mainly of overseeing other people's technical work, rather than doing any actual system architecture or development himself. This was exactly the kind of consulting team that would look impressive to someone like Marcus, someone who valued credentials and prestigious affiliations over practical knowledge and hands-on experience. But it was also exactly the wrong kind of team to assess and rebuild something as complex as Phoenix. Saturday passed quietly. I did some grocery shopping, went for a long run through Zilker Park, and tried to relax. But my mind kept returning to the authentication token sitting in my safe and the decision I knew I would eventually have to make. Phoenix wasn't just a computer system to me, it was 4 years of my life, thousands of hours of careful planning and implementation, a technical achievement that I was genuinely proud of. The idea of watching it get torn apart by people who didn't understand its elegance or importance was almost physically painful. Sunday afternoon, I received an unexpected email from David Rodriguez, TechFlow's board chair. David was someone I had met several times during board presentations about Phoenix's performance and strategic importance. Unlike Marcus, David had a technical background. He had been a software engineer before transitioning into executive roles, and he understood both the business and technical sides of the company. The email was brief and carefully worded. Sarah, I wanted to reach out personally to express my appreciation for your contributions to TechFlow over the past 4 years. Phoenix has been instrumental in our success, and I know that your expertise and dedication were key factors in that achievement. While I understand that the company is moving in a new direction, I hope you know that your work has been valued and recognized at the highest levels of the organization. Please don't hesitate to reach out if I can serve as a reference for future opportunities. Reading between the lines, I sensed that David wasn't entirely comfortable with Marcus's decision to terminate me. The fact that he had reached out personally on a weekend suggested that he was trying to maintain a relationship that might be valuable to both of us in the future. It also suggested that he might not be fully aligned with Marcus's vision for rebuilding Phoenix. I replied with a polite thank you note, expressing my appreciation for his support and leaving the door open for future communication. I didn't mention anything about my concerns regarding the consulting team or the technical challenges that Marcus was about to face. That wasn't my responsibility anymore. Monday morning arrived gray and cold, with the kind of overcast sky that seemed to match my mood. I made coffee and settled into my home office, opening my laptop to check the news and catch up on some technical reading. Around 9 a.m., my phone started buzzing with messages from former colleagues who were attending Marcus's all-hands meeting. The first message came from Jessica. Marcus is talking about exciting new partnerships and revolutionary technology upgrades. No mention of you specifically, just vague comments about bringing in new talent. Very corporate and buzzword heavy. 10 minutes later, he just introduced the Velocity Solutions team. Three guys in expensive suits who look like they've never seen actual code. They're talking about agile transformation and cloud-first architecture. People are asking practical questions about timelines and client impact, but getting very abstract answers. Then, someone just asked about Phoenix specifically, whether clients have been informed about the planned changes. Marcus said that's still being evaluated by the consulting team. Sarah, I don't think he's told our bank clients anything about this yet. That last message made me sit up straighter. If Marcus was planning to rebuild Phoenix without first getting approval from the banks that relied on it for their daily operations, he was walking into a regulatory and contractual nightmare. Financial institutions didn't just switch payment, processing systems on a whim. They required months of testing, compliance reviews, and risk assessments before making any significant changes to their transaction infrastructure. More messages trickled in throughout the morning. The consulting team is asking for access to production systems and development environments. IT is scrambling to set up accounts and permissions. They want complete documentation for all system components. Marcus told them to coordinate directly with the remaining engineering team. People are asking whether there will be layoffs as part of this transformation. Marcus gave a non-answer about evaluating all positions based on strategic fit. By lunchtime, the picture was becoming clear. Marcus was moving forward with his transformation plan at breakneck speed, driven by the kind of executive impatience that confused motion with progress. He wanted to show immediate results to justify his decision to fire me and hire expensive consultants. But he was doing so without understanding the technical complexities involved or the potential consequences of moving too quickly. The final message from Jessica came around 2 p.m. Sarah, something weird is happening. The Velocity team is trying to access some of Phoenix's administrative functions, but they're getting authentication errors. They're asking the engineering team for help, but nobody knows how to fix it. Marcus looks frustrated. How complicated did you make this system? I stared at that message for a long time, feeling a mixture of vindication and concern. Phoenix was working exactly as I had designed it to work. The consulting team was encountering the first layer of security protocols, and without proper authentication credentials, they were being locked out of the system's more sensitive functions. This wasn't malicious, it was simply good security design. But it was also the beginning of Marcus's education about the system he had dismissed as outdated legacy code. I didn't reply to Jessica's message immediately. Instead, I walked to my kitchen and made another cup of tea, thinking through the implications of what was happening at TechFlow. The authentication errors were just the beginning. If the consulting team continued trying to access Phoenix's administrative functions without proper credentials, the system would interpret their attempts as increasingly suspicious behavior. Eventually, Phoenix's automated security protocols would begin locking down additional functions, making it progressively more difficult for anyone to modify or maintain the system. It was an elegant solution to a common problem in systems administration. How do you protect critical infrastructure from unauthorized access while still allowing legitimate administrators to do their jobs? The answer was layered authentication and progressive lockdown. The more suspicious the access patterns became, the more restrictive the system would become, until eventually, only someone with complete authentication credentials could restore normal operations. I returned to my laptop and opened my encrypted documentation files, reviewing the detailed specifications for Phoenix's security protocols. According to the system logs that I could still access through a read-only administrative account, the consulting team had triggered the first level of security restrictions around 1 p.m. They would probably spend the rest of the afternoon trying to figure out why their access attempts were being rejected, assuming that it was a simple configuration issue that could be resolved by adjusting user permissions or resetting passwords. But it wasn't a configuration issue, it was a feature. And unless someone who understood Phoenix's architecture explained what was happening, the consulting team would continue triggering additional security protocols until the system became effectively unmaintainable. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself checking my phone more frequently. waiting for updates from Jessica or other former colleagues. But the messages had stopped coming, which probably meant that everyone at TechFlow was too busy dealing with the technical crisis to send text updates. Around 5 p.m., my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the area code was local to Austin. I answered cautiously. Sarah Chen? The voice was male, professional, with a slight edge of frustration. This is Sarah. This is Marcus Sullivan. We need to talk. I paused, letting the silence stretch for a moment before responding. Hello? Marcus. I wasn't expecting to hear from you. There's been a misunderstanding about some of the system access protocols for Phoenix. The consulting team is having some technical difficulties, and we were hoping you might be able to provide some guidance. I almost smiled. A misunderstanding. Technical difficulties. Marcus was still trying to frame this as a simple problem that could be solved with a quick phone call, rather than acknowledging that he had fired the one person who understood how to manage the system he was trying to rebuild. I'm not sure how I can help, I said calmly. My access to TechFlow systems was revoked on Thursday afternoon, and I'm no longer employed by the company. I understand that, Marcus said, his tone becoming more strained. But this is just a temporary consultation. We'd be happy to compensate you for your time. It's really just a matter of helping the Velocity team understand some of the authentication requirements. What specifically are they having trouble with? There was a pause and I could hear voices in the background. Marcus was probably in a conference room full of people trying to figure out what was going wrong with their expensive consulting project. They're getting locked out of some of the administrative functions, Marcus said finally. Error messages about insufficient authentication credentials. The remaining engineering team says it's something you implemented, but they don't have documentation about how to resolve it. I see, I said. And you'd like me to walk the consulting team through the authentication process? Exactly. Just a quick consultation to get them unblocked. We could schedule something for tomorrow morning. I looked out my window at the oak trees in my backyard, their leaves rustling in the late afternoon breeze. Marcus was asking me to fix the problem that he had created by firing me without understanding what I actually did. The irony wasn't lost on me, but I also understood the position he was in. Phoenix's security protocols were doing exactly what they were designed to do, and without my help, the consulting team would continue to trigger additional restrictions until the system became completely inaccessible. I'd be happy to help, I said finally. But given the complexity of the authentication system and the potential impact on your operations, this isn't really a quick consultation. It would be more appropriate to discuss this as a formal consulting engagement. Another pause. What kind of consulting engagement? Well, I said, choosing my words carefully. Given that Phoenix processes $2 billion in daily transactions and any extended downtime would affect multiple bank clients, I'd recommend treating this as a critical system recovery project. My standard rate for emergency consulting is $500 per hour, with a minimum engagement of 40 hours to properly assess and resolve authentication issues. The silence that followed told me that Marcus was doing the math. $20,000 minimum just to fix the problem that he had created by firing me 3 days earlier. That seems excessive for what should be a straightforward technical issue, Marcus said finally. I understand it might seem that way, I replied, but authentication system recovery isn't straightforward, especially when the consulting team doesn't have experience with Phoenix's specific architecture. If you'd prefer, I can provide you with some general guidance about system security protocols, but I can't take responsibility for resolving specific technical issues without a proper consulting agreement. I could hear more voices in the background. Urgent conversations about timelines and client impact. Marcus was clearly under pressure to get this resolved quickly, but he was also reluctant to pay what he probably saw as ransom to fix a problem that shouldn't exist in the first place. Let me discuss this with my team and get back to you, Marcus said. Of course. Just keep in mind that authentication lockouts tend to become more restrictive over time if they're not resolved properly. The sooner you address this, the easier it will be to fix. After Marcus hung up, I sat back in my chair and considered what had just happened. He had called me less than 4 days after firing me, asking for help with the system he had dismissed as outdated legacy code. The consulting team that was supposed to modernize Phoenix couldn't even access its basic administrative functions. But this was just the beginning. The authentication issues were only the first layer of Phoenix's security protocols. If Marcus continued trying to force his way through the system without proper credentials, he would discover that I had built much more sophisticated safeguards into the architecture. And if he refused to bring me back as a legitimate consultant, if he continued trying to solve this problem on the cheap, he would eventually trigger the one security protocol that would bring Phoenix to a complete halt: the emergency shutdown sequence that only I could reverse. I retrieved the authentication token from my safe and held it in my palm, feeling its weight. Such a small device, but it held the power to shut down a $500 million system that processed billions of dollars in daily transactions. Marcus Sullivan had no idea how much power he had just handed me when he decided I was redundant. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn clarity that made Austin beautiful, but I barely noticed the weather as I sat in my home office, monitoring the situation at TechFlow through a combination of industry contacts, social media updates, and the read-only system access that I still maintained through my personal administrative account. Marcus hadn't called back after our conversation the previous evening, which told me he was either trying to solve the authentication problem through other means or negotiating internally about whether to meet my consulting terms. Around 8 a.m., I received a text from Jessica that made it clear which path he had chosen. Marcus brought in additional consultants overnight, some kind of emergency response team that specializes in system access recovery. They've been working since 6 a.m. trying to crack Phoenix's authentication protocols. The office feels like a war room. I set down my coffee cup and opened my laptop, navigating to Phoenix's system monitoring dashboard. What I saw there made me both impressed with my own foresight and concerned about what Marcus was putting the system through. The authentication. Lockdown protocols had escalated overnight from level 1 to level 3, which meant that multiple unauthorized access attempts had been detected, and the system was now operating in a significantly restricted mode. Level 3. Lockdown meant that Phoenix would continue processing routine transactions for existing clients, but all administrative functions, system modifications, and new account creations were now blocked. More importantly, the system was actively logging every access attempt and building a behavioral profile of the unauthorized users. If the access attempts continued to escalate, Phoenix would automatically progress to level 4, which would begin restricting even routine operations and triggering client notification protocols about potential security concerns. I had designed these escalating security measures based on my experience with previous financial system breaches, where attackers often started with small probing attempts before launching full-scale attacks. The genius of the system was that it couldn't distinguish between malicious hackers and incompetent consultants. If someone was trying to access protected functions without proper credentials, Phoenix treated them as a potential threat regardless of their intentions. My phone buzzed with another message from Jessica. The emergency consultants are getting increasingly frustrated. They keep saying that Phoenix's security protocols are unnecessarily complex and poorly documented. Marcus is pushing them to find workarounds, but everything they try seems to make the situation worse. I almost laughed at the description of Phoenix's security as poorly documented. The system had extensive documentation, it was just encrypted and stored in locations that only I knew about. From the outside, it would appear that the authentication protocols were black boxes with no clear explanation of how they worked or how to bypass them. That was intentional design, not poor documentation. Around 10 a.m., my phone rang again. This time the caller ID showed David Rodriguez's direct number. As TechFlow's board chair, David would be getting briefed on any major operational issues, and a multi-day system access crisis definitely qualified as something that would escalate to board attention. "Good morning, David," I answered. "Sarah, I hope you don't mind me calling directly. I wanted to get your perspective on some technical issues that the company is experiencing with Phoenix." His tone was careful, professional, but I could detect an undercurrent of concern. Board chairs didn't usually get involved in day-to-day technical problems unless something was seriously wrong. "I'd be happy to help if I can," I said. Though I should mention that my access to TechFlow systems was terminated last week along with my employment. "I understand that," David said, "and I want you to know that the board wasn't consulted about that decision. Marcus made that call independently as part of his strategic restructuring initiative." That was interesting information. It suggested that David and possibly other board members weren't fully aligned with Marcus's approach to managing the technical team. It also suggested that Marcus might be in a more precarious position than he realized if his decisions were creating problems that required board intervention. "What specific issues is the company experiencing?" I asked. "From what I understand, the consulting team that Marcus hired is having difficulty accessing certain system functions. They're describing it as authentication problems, but the situation seems to be getting worse rather than better, despite their efforts to resolve it." I chose my words carefully. Phoenix has robust security protocols designed to protect against unauthorized access attempts. If someone is trying to access administrative functions without proper credentials, the system will interpret that as potentially malicious behavior and respond accordingly. "And how would one obtain proper credentials?" "That depends on the specific functions they're trying to access. Basic user accounts can be created through standard procedures, but administrative access requires a more comprehensive authentication process that includes multiple security factors." David was quiet for a moment. "Sarah, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I'd appreciate a direct answer. Can this situation be resolved without your involvement?" I considered how to respond. David was asking me to assess whether TechFlow could solve their authentication crisis without bringing me back, but he was also implicitly asking whether I had intentionally created this situation as some kind of revenge for being fired. "The authentication protocols are sophisticated but not impossible to work with," I said finally. "However, they do require someone who understands Phoenix's architecture and security model. The consulting team that Marcus hired appears to be approaching this as a standard system access problem, but Phoenix isn't a standard system. What would it take to resolve this situation quickly and permanently? Honestly, it would require someone with comprehensive knowledge of Phoenix's design and implementation to work directly with whoever is trying to access the system. They would need to understand not just how to provide the correct credentials, but why the authentication system works the way it does and how to avoid triggering additional security protocols. And you're the person with that knowledge." "I'm the person who designed and implemented those protocols. Yes." David was silent for a long moment. "Would you be willing to consult on this issue if the company requested your assistance?" "I would consider it, assuming we could reach agreement on appropriate terms for the engagement." "What kind of terms?" I had spent considerable time the previous evening thinking about this exact question. If TechFlow was going to ask for my help, I wanted to make sure that any consulting arrangement adequately reflected both the urgency of their situation and the value of my expertise. Given the complexity of the authentication system and the potential impact on operations, I would recommend a comprehensive consulting engagement rather than a quick fix. My rate for emergency system recovery work is $750 per hour, with a minimum commitment of 60 hours to properly assess the situation, implement solutions, and document the process for future reference. David did the math quickly. $45,000 minimum. That's correct. I would also require a formal consulting agreement that includes appropriate liability protections and intellectual property clauses, since this work would involve accessing and modifying systems that I originally designed. That seems reasonable given the circumstances, David said, which surprised me. I had expected more pushback on the financial terms. I should mention that this kind of authentication recovery work is time-sensitive, I continued. The longer the system remains in lockdown mode, the more restrictive the security protocols become. What might take 60 hours to resolve today could take significantly longer if the situation continues to escalate. How much longer? It's difficult to predict exactly, but Phoenix's security system is designed to become progressively more restrictive in response to sustained unauthorized access attempts. If the current situation continues for several more days, we could be looking at a level 5 lockdown, which would begin affecting routine transaction processing and triggering automated client notifications about security concerns. I could hear David taking notes on the other end of the line. Level 5 lockdown was terminology that would definitely get board attention, especially when combined with client notifications about security concerns. How long before level 5? David asked. Based on the current escalation pattern, probably 48 to 72 hours unless the unauthorized access attempts stop completely. And what happens at level 5? The system begins restricting routine operations and automatically notifies clients about potential security issues affecting their transaction processing. At that point, we would likely start receiving calls from bank compliance departments asking questions about Phoenix's security status. David was quiet for a moment, processing the implications of what I had just told him. Sarah, I'm going to be direct with you. The board needs this situation resolved quickly and permanently. If you're willing to take on this consulting engagement, I'll personally ensure that we can reach agreement on terms and get you started immediately. I appreciate that, David. I would be willing to begin work as soon as we have a signed consulting agreement and appropriate system access has been restored. How quickly can you be ready to start? I looked at my calendar, which was completely empty since I had been unemployed for less than a week. I could begin this afternoon if necessary. Excellent. I'll have our legal team prepare a consulting agreement based on the terms we discussed, and I'll personally handle getting your system access restored. Can you be available for a phone conference with the legal team around 2 p.m. to finalize the details? Absolutely. After ending the call with David, I sat back in my chair and considered what had just happened. In less than a week, I had gone from being fired as redundant to being asked back as an emergency consultant at nearly double my previous hourly rate. Marcus's attempt to save money by firing me had just cost the company at least $45,000. And that was assuming I could resolve the authentication crisis quickly without triggering additional security protocols. I spent the next hour reviewing my notes about Phoenix's authentication system and preparing a preliminary recovery plan. The situation was definitely fixable, but it would require careful coordination to avoid triggering level 4 or level 5 lockdowns while working through the authentication recovery process. Around noon, Jessica sent another update. Things are getting tense here. Marcus just had a closed-door meeting with David Rodriguez and 2 other board members. Right after that, he called the Velocity consultants into his office, and the conversation got pretty heated. I couldn't hear specifics, but there was definitely some yelling. 20 minutes later, the emergency consultants just packed up and left. They looked frustrated and were complaining loudly about intentionally obfuscated systems and impossible security requirements. Marcus is in damage control mode, trying to calm down the remaining engineering team. I wasn't surprised that the emergency consultants had given up. Phoenix's authentication system was designed to resist exactly the kind of brute force approach that most security specialists would try when faced with access restrictions. The more aggressively they tried to bypass the authentication protocols, the more restrictive the system would become. At exactly 2 p.m., I joined a conference call with TechFlow's legal team to review the consulting agreement. The conversation was straightforward and professional, with the lawyers asking reasonable questions about liability, confidentiality, and intellectual property rights. David had clearly given them instructions to prioritize speed and practicality over extensive legal maneuvering. The final agreement included my requested hourly rate and minimum commitment, along with standard clauses about confidentiality and intellectual property protection. More importantly, it included language that specifically authorized me to access and modify Phoenix's authentication systems as necessary to resolve the current crisis. By 3 p.m., I had a signed consulting agreement and restored access to Phoenix's administrative functions. I immediately logged into the system to assess the current situation and begin planning the recovery process. What I found was both better and worse than I had expected. The good news was that Phoenix was still processing routine transactions normally, and the basic system functions were operating within normal parameters. The bad news was that the various consulting teams had triggered nearly every authentication security protocol except the most severe ones, leaving the system in a very restrictive state that would require careful step-by-step recovery to avoid pushing it into complete lockdown. I spent the next 2 hours documenting the current system state and developing a detailed recovery plan that would restore normal administrative access without triggering additional security protocols. The process would need to be executed in a specific sequence with careful timing between steps to allow the authentication system to verify that each action was being performed by an authorized user. Around 5 p.m., I received a call from Marcus. His tone was significantly different from our conversation the previous day, more humble, less defensive. Sarah, I want to thank you for agreeing to help us resolve this authentication issue. I know the circumstances haven't been ideal, and I appreciate your professionalism in working with us despite that. I'm glad we could reach an agreement, I replied neutrally. David Rodriguez mentioned that you've already begun assessing the situation. What's your initial evaluation? The system is in Level 3 lockdown, which means that administrative functions are restricted, but routine operations are still working. Normally, the recovery process will take some time because we need to carefully authenticate each step to avoid triggering additional security protocols. How much time are we talking about? If everything goes smoothly, I should be able to restore normal administrative access within 24 to 36 hours. However, this assumes that no one else attempts to access restricted functions while I'm working on the recovery process. I'll make sure that all consulting work on Phoenix is suspended until you've completed the recovery, Marcus said quickly. That would be helpful. I should also mention that going forward, any major changes to Phoenix's architecture or security protocols should be coordinated with someone who understands the system's design. The authentication issues you've experienced this week are exactly what Phoenix was designed to do when it detects potentially unauthorized access attempts. There was a pause. I'm beginning to understand that Phoenix is more complex than I initially realized. That was probably the closest thing to an apology that I was going to get from Marcus Sullivan, and I decided to accept it gracefully, rather than dwelling on the mistakes that had led to this situation. Phoenix is a sophisticated system designed to handle sophisticated requirements, I said. Financial transaction processing involves unique challenges around security, compliance, and reliability that don't exist in most other applications. Could we schedule a briefing once you've completed the recovery process? I'd like to better understand Phoenix's capabilities and requirements so we can make more informed decisions about future development. Absolutely. I think that would be valuable for everyone involved. After ending the call with Marcus, I returned to working on the authentication recovery plan. The process was methodical and somewhat tedious, requiring me to carefully authenticate each administrative function while monitoring the system's security protocols to ensure that my actions were being properly recognized as legitimate rather than suspicious. By 8 p.m., I had successfully restored about 60% of the restricted administrative functions and was confident that I could complete the recovery process the following day without triggering any additional security protocols. Phoenix was beginning to return to normal operational status, and the immediate crisis was clearly under control. I closed my laptop and made myself dinner, reflecting on the strange turn that my week had taken. 7 days ago, I had been a TechFlow employee with a stable job and a clear career path. Now I was an independent consultant being paid premium rates to fix problems that had been created by my own termination. The situation wasn't entirely satisfying. There was still an element of injustice in being fired for building something too well, only to be hired back to explain how it worked. But there was also a certain poetic justice in demonstrating my value through the very systems that Marcus had dismissed as outdated legacy code. More importantly, the consulting arrangement gave me leverage that I hadn't possessed as an employee. As a consultant, I had more control over my working conditions, my rates, and my relationship with the company. If Marcus decided he didn't like my recommendations or wanted to pursue some ill-conceived modernization project, I could simply complete my current engagement and walk away, leaving him to deal with the consequences. As I prepared for bed, I checked my phone one more time and found a message from Jessica. Word is spreading through the office that you're back as a consultant working on the Phoenix issues. People are relieved that someone who actually understands the system is handling the recovery. Morale has definitely improved since this morning. I smiled as I read the message. My former colleagues understood the value of expertise and experience, even if their leadership initially hadn't. Phoenix wasn't just a technical achievement. It was also a symbol of what could be accomplished when intelligent people were given the resources and authority to build something properly. Tomorrow, I would complete the authentication recovery process and begin the larger conversation about Phoenix's future development. But tonight, I was content to know that I had successfully navigated the transition from undervalued employee to valued consultant, and that the system I had built was continuing to demonstrate its worth exactly as I had designed it to do. Wednesday. Morning brought with it a sense of purpose that I hadn't felt since before Marcus arrived at TechFlow. I was back in control, not as an employee who could be dismissed on a whim, but as an independent expert whose knowledge was essential to the company's operations. The authentication recovery process had gone smoothly overnight, with Phoenix's security protocols gradually recognizing my legitimate access patterns and beginning to restore normal administrative functions. By 9 a.m., I had successfully restored 85% of the restricted functions, and the system was operating in what I classified as cautious normal mode, still slightly more restrictive than usual, but fully functional for all practical purposes. The remaining recovery work would take another few hours, but the immediate crisis was effectively over. I was reviewing the final authentication sequences when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Jessica's number, but when I answered, the voice on the other end wasn't hers. "Sarah, this is Tom Martinez from the engineering team. Jessica gave me your number because we're having an issue that we think you need to know about immediately." Tom was one of the senior developers who had worked closely with me on Phoenix's implementation. He was technically competent and not prone to panic, so if he was calling with an urgent issue, it was probably something significant. "What's happening, Tom?" "We just received an automated alert from one of our major bank clients. First National Texas is reporting intermittent transaction processing delays that started about 20 minutes ago. The delays are minor so far, maybe an extra 2 or 3 seconds per transaction, but their compliance system is flagging it as a potential service degradation." I immediately opened my laptop and pulled up Phoenix's real-time monitoring dashboard. What I saw there made my stomach drop. The authentication recovery process had been progressing normally, but something had changed in the last 30 minutes. Phoenix was showing signs of system stress that shouldn't have been occurring during a routine administrative recovery. "Tom, I'm looking at the system monitors now. Are there any other consulting teams or external parties currently accessing Phoenix? Not that I know of. Marcus specifically told everyone to stay away from the system until you completed the recovery process. I dug deeper into the system logs, tracing the source of the performance degradation. What I found was deeply concerning. Someone with administrative credentials was attempting to access Phoenix's core transaction processing engine, but they were doing so in a way that suggested they didn't understand the system's architecture. The access attempts weren't malicious, but they were inefficient and poorly coordinated, causing Phoenix to allocate additional processing resources to handle what should have been routine administrative queries. Tom, I need you to check something for me. Has anyone from the Velocity Consulting team been given new access credentials in the last hour? Let me check with IT. There was a pause while Tom presumably made another call. Sarah, IT says they restored administrative access for 2 Velocity consultants about 45 minutes ago. Marcus apparently told them that you had cleared the authentication issues, and it was safe to resume the modernization assessment. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, feeling the familiar surge of frustration that came from watching someone make a predictable mistake. Marcus had jumped the gun, assuming that because the authentication crisis was mostly resolved, it was safe to let the consulting team resume their work. He didn't understand that Phoenix was still in a delicate state during the recovery process, and that additional administrative activity could destabilize the very systems I was trying to restore. Tom, I need you to contact Marcus immediately and tell him that all external access to Phoenix needs to be suspended again until I complete the recovery process. The consulting team's access attempts are interfering with the authentication restoration and causing system performance issues. I'll call him right now. And Tom, if First National Texas calls again about transaction delays, have them contact me directly. I may need to implement some temporary performance optimizations while we sort this out. After ending the call, with Tom, I spent the next 20 minutes analyzing the impact of the consulting team's renewed access attempts. The situation wasn't catastrophic yet, but it was heading in that direction. Phoenix's performance was degrading as the system tried to handle both my careful authentication recovery process and the consulting team's clumsy exploration of the system architecture. Worse, the consulting team seemed to be following some kind of systematic assessment checklist, probing different components of Phoenix's infrastructure in a way that was triggering resource allocation conflicts. It was like watching someone try to perform surgery while someone else was doing jumping jacks in the operating room, not directly harmful, but definitely not helping. My phone rang again. This time, it was Marcus, and his tone carried the kind of controlled urgency that suggested he was trying not to panic. Sarah, Tom Martinez just briefed me on the performance issues. I had no idea that resuming the consulting work would interfere with your recovery process. The authentication system is still in a sensitive state, I explained. Phoenix is gradually learning to trust administrative access again, but additional activity during this process confuses the security protocols and causes performance degradation. The consulting team says they're just conducting a preliminary assessment. They're not making any changes to the system. Marcus, just conducting an assessment means running diagnostic queries against every major system component. Phoenix interprets that as potentially suspicious behavior, especially when it's happening simultaneously with authentication recovery procedures. There was a pause. How serious is this situation? I looked at my monitoring dashboard, where the performance metrics were continuing to deteriorate slowly but steadily. If the consulting team continues their current assessment pattern, Phoenix will probably trigger Level 4 security protocols within the next 2 hours. Level 4 means that transaction processing will slow down significantly, and our bank clients will start receiving automated notifications about service degradation. What do you need me to do? Suspend all consulting team access immediately, and don't restore it until I've completed the authentication recovery and had a chance to brief them on proper assessment procedures. Done. How long until you can complete the recovery? If there are no more interruptions, about 4 hours. Then I'll need another 2 hours to optimize system performance and return Phoenix to normal operational status. And then the consulting team can resume their work? I hesitated before answering, because the honest response was more complicated than Marcus probably wanted to hear. They can resume their work, but they'll need to follow specific protocols to avoid triggering security responses. Phoenix isn't designed to accommodate the kind of broad-spectrum diagnostic assessment that most consulting teams prefer. What kind of protocols? They'll need to coordinate their assessment activities with someone who understands Phoenix's architecture, and they'll need to limit their access to specific system components rather than trying to analyze everything simultaneously. Think of it as the difference between a careful medical examination and a full-body MRI. Both can provide valuable information, but one is much more disruptive to the patient. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Sarah, I'm starting to realize that this modernization project is going to be more complex than I initially anticipated. That was a significant admission coming from someone who had dismissed Phoenix as outdated legacy code just a week earlier. Phoenix is a sophisticated system built to handle sophisticated requirements, I said. Any major changes to its architecture will need to be planned and implemented very carefully to avoid disrupting operations. Could we schedule a comprehensive briefing once you've stabilized the system? I'd like to understand exactly what we're dealing with before making any decisions about future development. Absolutely. I think that would be the best next step. After ending the call with Marcus, I returned to the authentication recovery process, working more quickly now that I understood the time pressure. The consulting team's interference had set back my progress by several hours, but the situation was still manageable if I could complete the work without further interruptions. By 2 p.m., I had successfully restored all administrative functions and begun implementing performance optimizations to counteract the degradation caused by the morning's diagnostic conflicts. Phoenix was responding well to the optimizations, with transaction processing times returning to normal levels and system resource utilization stabilizing within acceptable parameters. Around 3:30, I received a call from David Rodriguez, asking for a status update. I briefed him on the recovery progress and the morning's complications, emphasizing that the immediate crisis was resolved, but that future consulting work would need to be more carefully coordinated. Sarah, I want to discuss something with you beyond the immediate technical issues, David said. The board has been reviewing the events of the past week, and we're concerned about the risks associated with having critical system knowledge concentrated in external consulting relationships. What kind of risks are you referring to? Well, for example, if you hadn't been available to resolve this authentication crisis, we could have faced a major operational disruption. That's not a sustainable position for the company to be in. I understood what David was getting at, but I wanted to hear him articulate it clearly. What are you suggesting? We'd like to discuss the possibility of bringing you back as a permanent employee, but in a role that gives you more authority over Phoenix's development and maintenance. Something like a Chief Technology Officer position with specific responsibility for our core infrastructure. That was an interesting proposition. A CTO role would give me the authority to prevent future situations like the one Marcus had created, and it would ensure that Phoenix's ongoing development was handled by people who understood its architecture and requirements. That's worth discussing, I said carefully. Though I should mention that my experience this week has given me a new appreciation for the flexibility and independence that comes with consulting work. I understand that. We'd want to structure the role in a way that gives you the autonomy you need to do your job effectively, along with the authority to make technical decisions without interference from other executives. What about Marcus? I assume he would still be CEO. There was a long pause. Marcus's position is currently under review by the board. His decision-making process during this crisis raised some concerns about his understanding of the company's technical assets and operational requirements. That was diplomatically phrased, but the implication was clear. Marcus's job was in jeopardy because he had nearly caused a major operational crisis through his ignorance of the systems that powered the company's revenue. "I'd be interested in discussing a CTO role," I said, "but I'd want to have a clear understanding of the reporting structure and decision-making authority before making any commitments." "Of course. Could we schedule a formal discussion for early next week? That would give us time to complete the current consulting engagement and properly structure a comprehensive offer." "That works for me." After ending the call with David, I spent another hour completing the Phoenix optimization process and running comprehensive diagnostics to ensure that all systems were operating normally. By 5 p.m., Phoenix was not only fully recovered from the authentication crisis, but actually performing slightly better than it had before the problems began, thanks to some efficiency improvements I had implemented during the recovery process. I called Tom Martinez to confirm that all systems were stable and that normal operations could resume. "Tom, Phoenix is back to full operational status. You can tell Marcus that it's safe to resume normal administrative activities, but I'd recommend waiting until tomorrow before allowing any external consulting work." "Will do. And Sarah, everyone on the engineering team wanted me to tell you how much they appreciate what you did this week. We were all pretty worried about what would happen to Phoenix under the new management, but seeing how you handled this situation makes us feel a lot more confident about the future." "Thanks. Tom, Phoenix is a great system built by a great team. I'm just glad we were able to protect that work." That evening, I received one final call from Marcus. His tone was subdued, almost reflective. "Sarah, I want to thank you for resolving this situation professionally and completely. I also want to apologize for the way I handled your termination last week. I made assumptions about Phoenix and your role that were clearly incorrect, and those assumptions nearly caused serious problems for the company." "I appreciate that, Marcus. I've been talking with David Rodriguez about the lessons learned from this experience, and I think it's clear that I need to take a different approach to managing the company's technical assets. I don't have the background to make informed decisions about systems like Phoenix, and I should have recognized that earlier." "Technical systems can be complex," I said diplomatically. "The important thing is learning from the experience and making better decisions going forward. David mentioned that the board is considering offering you a CTO position. I want you to know that I would fully support that appointment. The company needs someone with your expertise in a leadership role, and I think you've more than demonstrated your qualifications this week." "Thank you. I'll definitely consider any formal offer the board makes." "There's one more thing I wanted to mention," Marcus continued. "The Velocity Consulting team submitted their final report this afternoon. Their conclusion was that Phoenix is actually a remarkably well-designed system that would be extremely difficult and expensive to replace. They recommended focusing on incremental improvements and modernization rather than attempting a complete rebuild." I almost smiled at that. It had taken a week-long crisis and nearly $50,000 in emergency consulting fees, but Marcus had finally received an expert opinion confirming what I had tried to tell him in the first place. Phoenix was valuable exactly as it was. "That sounds like a reasonable recommendation," I said. "I think so too. And I think it's going to require someone with your level of expertise to implement properly." After ending the call with Marcus, I sat on my back porch with a glass of wine, watching the sunset paint the Austin sky in shades of orange and pink. The authentication crisis was over. Phoenix was running better than ever, and I had successfully transformed a termination into a consulting triumph that had led to discussions about an executive position. But beyond the professional satisfaction, there was something deeper that I had gained from this experience. A clear understanding of my own value and a recognition that expertise couldn't be easily replaced or replicated. Marcus had fired me thinking that anyone could manage Phoenix, but the events of the past week had demonstrated that complex systems required people who understood them intimately. The authentication crisis had been a perfect demonstration of what I had built into Phoenix from the beginning: protection against its own mismanagement. The system had defended itself against incompetent handling, exactly as I had designed it to do, and in the process, it had forced everyone involved to recognize the value of the expertise required to maintain it properly. Friday morning, I received an email from Jessica with a link to an internal company announcement that made me smile. TechFlow Dynamics is pleased to announce that Dr. Sarah Chen will be joining our executive team as Chief Technology Officer, effective immediately. Dr. Chen brings extensive expertise in financial technology systems and will be responsible for overseeing all technical operations and strategic development initiatives. The announcement was accompanied by a photo of me from our last team off-site, standing in front of a whiteboard covered with Phoenix architecture diagrams. I looked confident and competent, exactly the way I felt now that I had successfully navigated the transition from undervalued employee to essential executive. But the real validation came in the dozens of congratulatory messages I received from former colleagues, industry contacts, and even some of the bank clients who relied on Phoenix for their daily operations. The consensus was clear. TechFlow had made the right decision in recognizing my expertise and giving me the authority to protect and develop the systems I had built. A week later, I walked back into the TechFlow building for my first day as CTO. This time through the executive entrance with a new keycard that gave me access to every floor and every system. The marble lobby looked the same, but my perspective had changed completely. I wasn't returning as someone who could be dismissed by an ignorant executive. I was returning as someone whose expertise had been proven essential to the company's success. My first meeting as CTO was with the engineering team, the same people who had watched Marcus dismiss my work and then scrambled to find emergency consultants when Phoenix's security protocols defended themselves. The meeting was scheduled in our largest conference room, and when I walked in, the entire team stood up and applauded. "Welcome back, Sarah," Tom Martinez said, grinning broadly. "We've got a lot of work to do, and we're excited to do it with someone who actually understands what we've built." Over the following months, I implemented a comprehensive technical leadership framework that ensured Phoenix's continued development while protecting it from future mismanagement. We established clear protocols for system modifications, created extensive documentation for all critical functions, and built redundant expertise across the engineering team so that no single person would ever again hold all the keys to our most important systems. But I also made sure to preserve the elegant security features that had protected Phoenix during its greatest crisis. The authentication protocols remained sophisticated and uncompromising, ready to defend the system against anyone who might try to modify it without proper understanding and authorization. Because sometimes, the best way to protect something valuable is to build it so well that it can protect itself. The consulting team from Velocity Solutions never returned to TechFlow. Their final invoice included a note explaining that Phoenix's architecture was incompatible with standard modernization approaches and recommending that any future changes be implemented by people with deep system-specific expertise. It was the most expensive way possible for Marcus to learn that some problems can't be solved by throwing money at them. Marcus himself lasted another 6 months as CEO, before stepping down to pursue other opportunities. His farewell email praised TechFlow's technical achievements and specifically mentioned Phoenix as a testament to the importance of investing in world-class engineering talent. It was a graceful exit that acknowledged his mistakes without dwelling on them. David Rodriguez was elected to replace Marcus as CEO, and one of his first acts was to establish a policy requiring board approval for any decision that affected key technical personnel or core system architecture. It was a safeguard designed to prevent future executives from making uninformed decisions about assets they didn't understand. Today, Phoenix processes over $3 billion in daily transactions for 15 major banks across the United States. It remains one of the most reliable and secure payment processing platforms in the industry, with uptime that consistently exceeds 99.99%. The system that Marcus had dismissed as outdated legacy code continues to generate hundreds of millions of dollars in annual revenue for TechFlow. But more importantly, Phoenix stands as a reminder that true expertise can't be easily replaced or dismissed. The system I built didn't just process transactions. It preserved the value of knowledge, protected itself from mismanagement, and ultimately ensured that competence would be recognized and rewarded. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can build isn't just a system that works perfectly. Sometimes it's a system that knows how to protect itself and the people who understand it. And sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's simply building something so well that it forces everyone around it to recognize excellence when they see it. The authentication token still sits in my office safe, though I've never needed to use the emergency shutdown sequence it controls. Phoenix has been strong enough to defend itself through patient, progressive security protocols rather than dramatic system failures. But knowing that I built those ultimate safeguards gives me confidence that no future executive will ever again be able to dismiss the value of what we've created. Because when you build something properly, it protects both itself and the people who understand it. And that's a lesson that Marcus Sullivan learned the expensive way. Never underestimate the power of a woman who knows exactly what she's worth and has the technical skills to prove it. 3 years had passed since the authentication crisis that transformed my career, and as I stood in the executive conference room on the 42nd floor of TechFlow's new headquarters building, I could barely recognize the company I had once worked for as a systems architect. The view from this height showcased downtown Austin's explosive growth, with construction cranes dotting the skyline like mechanical flowers reaching toward the Texas sun. But the real transformation wasn't visible from the window, it was in the culture, the technology, and the people who now looked to me for technical leadership. The conference room was filled with representatives from 7 major financial institutions, all gathered for what had become an annual tradition, the Phoenix User Summit. What had started as a simple client meeting had evolved into the premier gathering for payment processing professionals, where banks, credit unions, and fintech companies came to learn about the latest developments in secure transaction technology. As Chief Technology Officer, I had transformed TechFlow from a single product company into an industry leader whose innovations were setting standards across the financial services sector. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, addressing the assembled executives and technical directors. 3 years ago, Phoenix was processing $2 billion in daily transactions for 12 banking clients. Today, we're handling over $8 billion daily for 43 institutions across North America, and our uptime has improved to 99.997%. The statistics were impressive, but they only told part of the story. Under my leadership as CTO, we had not only expanded Phoenix's capabilities, but had also developed an entire ecosystem of complementary technologies. Phoenix Quantum, our real-time fraud detection system, used machine learning algorithms to identify suspicious transactions within milliseconds. Phoenix Secure, our end-to-end encryption platform, provided military-grade security for sensitive financial data. Phoenix Analytics offered banks unprecedented insights into transaction patterns and customer behavior. What made me most proud, however, wasn't the technology itself, but the team that had built it. The engineering department had grown from 8 people to 47, and every single hire had been personally approved by me based on technical competence rather than credentials or connections. We had recruited brilliant minds from across the industry, but more importantly, we had created an environment where innovation flourished and expertise was valued above politics. Jennifer Walsh, our Director of Security Architecture, was presenting the latest Phoenix Secure developments to the banking executives. Jennifer had joined us 18 months ago from a prestigious cybersecurity firm, attracted by our reputation for technical excellence and our commitment to giving engineers the authority to make decisions about their own domains. She was explaining how our new quantum-resistant encryption protocols would protect against future threats from quantum computing, a problem that most financial institutions were only beginning to understand. The mathematical foundations of current encryption standards will become vulnerable within the next decade, Jennifer was saying, her presentation slides showing complex cryptographic algorithms that would have been incomprehensible to most executives. Phoenix Secure's quantum-resistant protocols ensure that your transaction data will remain protected even after quantum computers become commercially viable. I watched the faces of the banking representatives as they absorbed this information. Some looked concerned about threats they hadn't previously considered, while others seemed impressed by our foresight in addressing future challenges. This was exactly the kind of long-term thinking that had distinguished TechFlow under my technical leadership from the short-sighted approach that had characterized Marcus Sullivan's brief tenure. After Jennifer's presentation, I took questions from the audience. The first came from Margaret Chen, the Chief Information Officer at Texas Regional Bank, one of our longest-standing clients. Dr. Chen, she said, your team has consistently delivered innovations that exceed our expectations. How do you maintain such high standards while scaling your operations so rapidly? It was a question I had been asked many times, and my answer had become something of a philosophy that guided our entire organization. We hire for competence and curiosity rather than compliance and conformity, I replied. Every person on our technical team is someone I would trust to architect a critical system independently. When you surround yourself with genuinely capable people and give them the authority to make decisions in their areas of expertise, innovation becomes inevitable. The next question came from David Park, a vice president at Metropolitan Trust, a bank that had recently signed on as a Phoenix client after their previous payment processor had suffered a major security breach. We've heard impressive things about Phoenix's security track record, he said. Can you tell us about your approach to protecting against insider threats and unauthorized system modifications? I smiled, remembering the authentication crisis that had first demonstrated Phoenix's self-protective capabilities. Phoenix was designed from the beginning with the assumption that threats could come from anywhere, including inside the organization. The system includes multiple layers of authentication and authorization, with progressive security protocols that respond to suspicious behavior patterns. If someone attempts to access or modify critical functions without proper credentials, Phoenix gradually restricts their access until the situation can be properly evaluated. Has this ever been tested in a real-world scenario? David asked. Extensively, I replied, thinking about Marcus and his consulting team. Phoenix's security protocols have successfully defended against various types of unauthorized access attempts, and the system has never experienced a security breach or unauthorized modification in its entire operational history. What I didn't mention was that the authentication protocols had been quietly updated and enhanced over the past 3 years to make them even more sophisticated. The emergency shutdown sequence that I had built into the original system remained in place, but it was now one of dozens of protective measures designed to ensure that Phoenix could defend itself against any conceivable threat. After the formal presentations, I found myself in a smaller meeting with executives from First Bank of Dallas, discussing their plans to expand into cryptocurrency processing. This was exactly the kind of forward-thinking conversation that energized me as a technical leader, people who understood that innovation required taking calculated risks rather than simply maintaining the status quo. The regulatory environment for cryptocurrency is still evolving, I explained, but we're already developing the infrastructure to support digital asset transactions when the legal framework becomes clearer. Phoenix Crypto will integrate seamlessly with our existing payment processing platform while providing the additional security and compliance features that digital currencies require. The meeting concluded with First Bank of Dallas agreeing to participate in our beta testing program for cryptocurrency integration, making them the first major Texas bank to prepare for what many experts believed would be the next evolution in financial technology. As the Phoenix User Summit concluded that afternoon, I received a message from my assistant that made me pause. Dr. Chen, there's someone here to see you. He says his name is Marcus Sullivan and that you know him from when he used to work at TechFlow. I hadn't seen or heard from Marcus since his departure 3 years ago. According to industry gossip, he had taken a position with a consulting firm in California before eventually starting his own digital transformation company. I was curious about what had brought him back to Austin and why he wanted to see me after all this time. I found Marcus waiting in the lobby of our new headquarters, looking older and somewhat more subdued than I remembered. His expensive suit and confident posture were the same, but there was something different in his demeanor, something that suggested experience had taught him lessons that his MBA hadn't covered. "Hello, Marcus," I said, extending my hand professionally. "This is unexpected." "Sarah, thank you for agreeing to see me. I know I don't have any right to take up your time, but I was hoping we could talk for a few minutes." I gestured toward a quiet seating area in the lobby. "Of course. What brings you to Austin?" "I'm here for a client meeting with a local financial services company that's considering a technology modernization project," he said. When I learned that the meeting was just a few blocks from TechFlow's new headquarters, I thought I should stop by to see what you've accomplished. Marcus looked around the impressive lobby, with its modern architecture and digital displays showcasing TechFlow's various technology platforms. "This is quite different from the old building." We've grown significantly," I said simply. "I can see that. I've been following TechFlow's progress in the industry publications. Phoenix has become something of a legend in financial technology circles. And I understand you've been personally recognized with several innovation awards." It was true. Over the past 3 years, I had received the Women in Technology Leadership Award, the Financial Services Innovation Prize, and had been named one of the top 40 under 40 technology executives by Austin Business Journal. But more importantly, TechFlow had become a company that other organizations studied as an example of how to build and maintain critical technology infrastructure. "The team has done excellent work," I replied, deflecting the focus from personal accolades to collective achievement. Marcus nodded. "Sarah, I came here because I wanted to apologize to you properly. What I did 3 years ago was wrong, and the way I treated you and your work was inexcusable. I thought I understood technology because I could talk about trends and strategies, but I had no appreciation for the complexity and expertise required to actually build and maintain systems like Phoenix." I studied his face, looking for signs of insincerity or manipulation, but what I saw appeared to be genuine remorse. "I appreciate that, Marcus. The consulting firm I started focuses on helping companies avoid the kinds of mistakes I made at TechFlow," he continued. "Most of our work involves advising executives about the importance of technical expertise and the risks of making technology decisions without understanding the underlying systems." That was unexpectedly humble, and it suggested that Marcus had learned more from our confrontation than I had realized at the time. "That sounds like valuable work." "It is, but it's also a constant reminder of how much I didn't understand when I was at TechFlow. Every client engagement reinforces the lesson that you tried to teach me, that expertise can't be easily replaced, and that dismissing knowledgeable people is usually the most expensive mistake a leader can make." Marcus leaned forward slightly. "I've heard through industry connections that you're being recruited by several Fortune 500 companies for CTO positions. There are rumors that you're considering offers from major tech companies in Silicon Valley." He was right about the recruitment efforts. Over the past year, I had received increasingly attractive offers from companies that wanted to replicate TechFlow's success in their own organizations. The most recent offer had come from a major cloud computing company that was looking for someone to lead their financial services division. The compensation package was substantial, but more importantly, the role would give me the opportunity to influence technology development across hundreds of companies, rather than just one. "There have been some interesting conversations," I admitted. "I don't expect you to tell me your plans," Marcus said, "but I wanted you to know that whatever you decide to do, you have my complete support and endorsement." If any potential employer wants a reference about your capabilities or character, I would be honored to speak on your behalf. That was a genuinely surprising offer, considering our history. Why would you do that? Because you deserve recognition for what you've accomplished. And because I want to do whatever I can to support leaders who actually understand the systems they're responsible for. Marcus stood up, extending his hand again. Thank you for your time, Sarah. I know how valuable it is, and I'm grateful that you were willing to spend a few minutes with me. After Marcus left, I returned to my office and found myself thinking about the conversation and the broader question of what came next in my career. TechFlow was thriving under my technical leadership, but I had accomplished most of what I had set out to achieve when I accepted the CTO position. Phoenix and its related technologies were industry-leading, the engineering team was exceptional, and the company's culture emphasized expertise and innovation over politics and positioning. The offer from the cloud computing company would represent a significant step up in terms of scope and influence. As their financial services CTO, I would be responsible for technology platforms that served thousands of companies rather than dozens. It would also mean relocating to San Francisco and leaving behind the team and systems that I had spent years building. My assistant knocked on my office door, interrupting my thoughts. Dr. Chen, David Rodriguez would like to see you when you have a moment. He said it's not urgent, but he'd like to discuss something important. David had been an excellent CEO for the past 3 years, providing strategic leadership while giving me complete authority over technology decisions. Our working relationship was based on mutual respect and clearly defined responsibilities, which had allowed both of us to focus on our strengths without constant political maneuvering. I found David in his office reviewing financial reports from the Phoenix User Summit. Several of our banking clients had committed to expanding their use of our platforms, which would translate to millions of dollars in additional revenue over the next fiscal year. Sarah, excellent work with the summit today, David said. The client feedback has been overwhelmingly positive, and we've already received 3 requests for proposals for major platform expansions. The team did outstanding work preparing those presentations, I replied. Jennifer's quantum security briefing was particularly impressive. David nodded. That's actually related to what I wanted to discuss with you. I've been hearing rumors from industry contacts that you're being recruited by other companies. I wanted to address this directly rather than letting speculation create uncertainty. I had expected this conversation eventually. David was too well connected in the industry to miss the recruitment efforts that had been targeting me. There have been some inquiries about potential opportunities. I'm not surprised. You've built something remarkable here, and other companies want to replicate that success. David leaned back in his chair. The question is, what would it take to keep you at TechFlow? It was a fair question, and I had been thinking about it seriously as the external offers had become more attractive. Honestly, David, it's not just about compensation or title. What I've built here is important to me, and I'm proud of what the team has accomplished. But I'm also interested in challenges that would allow me to have broader impact on the industry. What kind of broader impact? The cloud computing offer would give me responsibility for financial technology platforms used by thousands of companies. It would be an opportunity to influence technology standards and innovation across the entire financial services sector. David was quiet for a moment, clearly considering the implications of what I had said. That's a compelling opportunity. But let me ask you this. What if we could create a similar level of impact without requiring you to leave TechFlow? What do you mean? I've been discussing with the board the possibility of spinning off our technology platform into a separate company, with you as CEO. Instead of just serving our current banking clients, we would license Phoenix and related technologies to other financial technology companies. You would have the opportunity to influence the entire industry while maintaining ownership of the systems you've built. That was an unexpected proposition. Creating a separate technology company would give me the autonomy and influence that I was seeking while allowing me to remain connected to the work that had defined my career. Tell me more about how that would work. TechFlow would retain a majority ownership stake, but the new company would operate independently with its own board of directors and strategic focus. You would have complete authority over technology development and business strategy, with the resources to expand into new markets and develop new platforms. The idea was intriguing, but it would also represent a significant change from my current role. What about the existing team? The people who have built Phoenix and the related technologies? They would transfer to the new company if they chose to, with enhanced compensation packages and equity participation. The goal would be to give your entire team the opportunity to benefit directly from the success of the platforms they've created. I spent the next hour discussing the details of David's proposal, including governance structure, financial arrangements, and strategic objectives. By the end of the conversation, I was genuinely excited about the possibility of leading an independent technology company while maintaining the relationships and systems that had become central to my professional identity. This would be a significant undertaking, I said finally. Creating a new company, establishing market presence, building client relationships beyond our current banking partners. It would be, David agreed. But you've already demonstrated that you can build technology platforms that transform industries. This would give you the opportunity to do that on a much larger scale. I'd need time to consider this carefully and discuss it with the team. Of course. Take all the time you need. This is the kind of decision that should be made thoughtfully, with input from everyone who would be affected. That evening, I drove home through Austin's bustling tech corridor, passing the offices of dozens of companies that had relocated to the city over the past few years. Austin had become a genuine alternative to Silicon Valley for technology companies, offering a more reasonable cost of living while maintaining access to world-class engineering talent. It was a transformation that paralleled my own journey from undervalued employee to industry leader. My house in South Austin had changed as well. The small craftsman bungalow had been expanded with a modern addition that included a home office and a workshop where I could experiment with new technologies away from corporate pressures. The herb garden had grown into a sophisticated landscape that provided fresh ingredients for the elaborate dinners I had started hosting for my team and industry colleagues. As I prepared dinner, I found myself thinking about the paths that had led to this moment. 3 years ago, I had been fired by an arrogant executive who dismissed my expertise as outdated thinking. Tonight, I was considering offers from multiple Fortune 500 companies and contemplating the creation of my own technology company. The transformation hadn't happened through dramatic confrontations or public victories, but through the quiet, consistent demonstration of competence and the patient building of systems that proved their worth over time. My phone buzzed with a text message from Jennifer Walsh. Sarah, incredible summit today. The quantum security presentation generated more interest than we expected. Already fielding calls from 3 banks that want to accelerate their implementation timelines. I smiled as I read the message. Jennifer represented the kind of technical leader that I had prioritized in building our team. Genuinely brilliant, deeply knowledgeable, and committed to solving complex problems rather than advancing personal agendas. If I decided to create an independent company, Jennifer would be exactly the kind of person I would want as a partner in that venture. Over dinner, I reviewed the materials that David had provided about the proposed spin-off, along with the offer packages from the external companies that had been recruiting me. Each option represented a different path forward, with distinct advantages and challenges. The cloud computing company offered immediate prestige and influence, along with resources that would dwarf anything available at TechFlow. But it would also mean abandoning the systems I had built and starting over in a new environment with new constraints and new politics. The independent company would allow me to maintain ownership of my work while expanding its impact, but it would also require building an entirely new business from the ground up. The risks were significant, but so was the potential for creating something genuinely transformative in the financial technology industry. As I considered these options, I realized that the decision wasn't really about choosing between different job opportunities. It was about deciding what kind of legacy I wanted to build and what kind of impact I wanted to have on the industry that had become my professional home. The authentication crisis 3 years ago had taught me that true expertise couldn't be easily dismissed or replaced, but it had also demonstrated that expertise without authority was vulnerable to the whims of incompetent leadership. The CTO position at TechFlow had given me the authority to protect and develop the systems I had built, but it had also shown me the potential for influencing technology development across an entire industry. Creating an independent company would represent the ultimate expression of the lessons I had learned. Building systems that could protect themselves, surrounding myself with genuinely competent people, and maintaining the authority to make decisions based on expertise rather than politics. 2 weeks later, I stood in the same conference room where I had presented to banking executives. But this time, the audience consisted of my entire engineering team. I had spent the intervening time discussing David's proposal with key team members, evaluating the financial and strategic implications, and developing a comprehensive plan for creating an independent technology company. "I've made a decision about our future direction," I began, looking at the faces of people who had become not just colleagues, but genuine collaborators in building something important. "We're going to spin off our technology platforms into an independent company with all of you as founding team members and equity participants." The reaction was immediate and enthusiastic. Tom Martinez, who had been with me since the original Phoenix development, grinned broadly. "Sarah, this is exactly what we've been hoping for. The opportunity to build something from the ground up while maintaining ownership of our work." Jennifer Walsh raised her hand. "What about our existing clients? How do we maintain those relationships while building new market presence?" "Our current banking clients will become the foundation customers for the new company," I explained. "TechFlow will retain a stake in the business, so there's natural alignment of interests. But we'll also be free to pursue new markets and develop new technologies without the constraints of a traditional corporate structure." Over the next hour, I outlined the details of the proposed company structure, including equity distribution, governance arrangements, and strategic objectives. The plan called for aggressive expansion into new financial technology markets while maintaining the technical excellence and innovation culture that had characterized our work at TechFlow. "What are we going to call this new company?" asked Robert Kim, our lead security engineer. I had been thinking about that question for weeks, and the answer had emerged from reflecting on the journey that had brought us to this point. "Quantum Financial Technologies," I said. "It reflects both our quantum-resistant security innovations and our commitment to making quantum leaps in financial technology capabilities." 3 months later, Quantum Financial Technologies officially launched with 43 employees, 15 major clients, and technology platforms that were already being recognized as industry standards. Our first major announcement was the release of Phoenix Quantum 2.0, a payment processing platform that incorporated quantum-resistant encryption, artificial intelligence fraud detection, and real-time regulatory compliance monitoring. The launch event was held in the same Austin Convention Center where I had first presented Phoenix's capabilities to skeptical banking executives 4 years earlier. But this time, I wasn't trying to convince anyone of our technology's value. Instead, I was announcing innovations that companies across the industry were eager to adopt. 4 years ago, I told the audience of financial services executives and technology leaders, I was told that my approach to building payment systems was outdated thinking. Today, those same systems are processing over $8 billion in daily transactions and setting security standards for the entire industry. I paused, looking out at an audience that included several of my former TechFlow colleagues, representatives from our banking clients, and executives from companies that wanted to license our technology platforms. But the real lesson isn't about vindication or proving critics wrong, I continued. It's about the importance of building things so well that they can protect themselves and the people who understand them. It's about surrounding yourself with genuinely competent people and giving them the authority to make decisions in their areas of expertise. And it's about never underestimating the power of quiet persistence in the face of loud ignorance. The audience applauded, but what made me most proud was seeing the faces of my team members in the front row. Jennifer Walsh, Tom Martinez, Robert Kim, and dozens of other brilliant engineers who had chosen to join me in building something new rather than accepting the limitations of traditional corporate structures. After the presentation, I found myself in conversation with Sarah Chen from Texas Regional Bank, one of our longest-standing clients who had supported our transition to an independent company. "Dr. Chen," she said, "your story has become something of a legend in our industry. The woman who was fired for building systems too well, only to prove that expertise can't be easily replaced. I prefer to think of it as a story about the importance of understanding the difference between competence and credentials," I replied. "Too many organizations make decisions based on impressive resumes rather than demonstrated ability to solve complex problems. What advice would you give to other technical professionals who find themselves undervalued or dismissed by leadership?" I had been asked this question many times over the past year, as my story had spread through professional networks and industry publications. My answer had evolved into a philosophy that guided both my personal decisions and my approach to building quantum financial technologies. Document everything, build things so well that they can defend themselves, and never accept someone else's assessment of your worth, I said. Competence is its own form of power, but only if you have the courage to exercise it when necessary. 6 months after founding Quantum Financial Technologies, I received an unexpected phone call from David Rodriguez. TechFlow had decided to fully divest their stake in our company, giving us complete independence while providing them with a substantial return on their technology investments. "Sarah," David said, "this has worked out better than we ever imagined. Quantum Financial Technologies has exceeded every projection, and TechFlow has benefited enormously from our association with your innovations. We're proud to have played a role in helping you build something extraordinary." The divestiture meant that Quantum Financial Technologies was now entirely owned by our founding team, with each employee holding equity stakes that reflected their contributions to our success. It was a structure that ensured everyone who helped build our technology platforms would benefit directly from their adoption across the industry. Today, as I write this from my office in Quantum Financial Technologies, new headquarters building, I can see the Austin skyline that has become a symbol of technological innovation and entrepreneurial success. Our company now employs over 200 people, serves clients across 3 continents, and generates annual revenue that exceeds what TechFlow had achieved in its entire corporate history. But the metrics that matter most to me aren't financial. They're the emails I receive from young women in technology who tell me that my story inspired them to advocate for their own expertise. They're the industry standards that have been adopted based on security protocols that I originally designed to protect Phoenix from mismanagement. They're the dozens of brilliant engineers who have joined our team because they wanted to work in an environment where competence is valued above politics. The authentication token that once controlled Phoenix's emergency shutdown sequence still sits in my desk drawer, though it's now a symbol rather than a functional necessity. Quantum Financial Technologies operates with the same protective principles that I built into Phoenix, but our safeguards are now embedded in corporate governance structures, intellectual property protections, and a culture that prioritizes expertise over authority. Marcus Sullivan occasionally appears in industry publications, quoted as an expert on the importance of technical leadership in digital transformation projects. I don't harbor any resentment toward him. His mistakes taught me lessons about the importance of building systems that can protect themselves and the value of maintaining control over my own professional destiny. The most satisfying part of this journey hasn't been the professional recognition or the financial success. It's been the demonstration that competence, persistence, and the courage to stand up for what you've built can overcome any amount of ignorance or arrogance. When someone tells you that your expertise is outdated or your approach is unnecessary, the best response isn't argument or anger. It's simply building something so well that it proves its own worth. And sometimes, if you're very lucky and very skilled, you get to watch the people who dismissed you eventually realize that they need exactly what you've always been capable of providing. Because true expertise isn't just about knowing how to build things. It's about building things that know how to protect themselves, the people who understand them, and the vision that created them. The story that began with my termination for building a system too well has become a story about building an entire company on the principle that excellence is its own form of power. And in a world that often confuses motion with progress and credentials with competence, that turns out to be exactly the kind of power the industry needs. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.